This episode of The Candid Frame is supported by Fujifilm's new integration with Frame.io, camera to cloud. A new integration between Fujifilm and Frame.io allows transferring of images or video to the web directly from your Fujifilm camera using C2C technology. Find out more by visiting fujifilm-x.com and clicking on Camera to Cloud. It's really easy to feel sad and depressed when human behavior makes things worse rather than better. War, mass shootings, prejudice, global warming, these and other events make it seem that we live in the worst rather than the best of times. Every generation experiences such thoughts and feelings, and yet they often find that they have survived such times and overcome the worst of their imagined outcomes. Yet it's hard to be that hopeful when all that's wrong in the world is magnified and distributed en masse every single moment of the day. However, there are countless stories that run counter to that hopeless narrative. They showcase that despite the insurmountable odds, there is still good that is worth doing and that is being done for the benefit of humans and the other creatures we share this planet with. Mark Edward Harris's most recent book, The People of the Forest, focuses on the plight of orangutans. The book documents how the palm oil industry and war have threatened the existence of our fellow primates. Yet it also showcases how people are fighting to save this important species and the habitat they depend on. Mark, who was one of the show's earliest guests, has made a career of overcoming difficult challenges to tell and share important stories. I'm honored and humbled to spend time with him again. This is Ibarian X, and welcome back to The Candid Frame. But it's good to talk to you again. It's been a long time.
Yeah, I started our first conversation for this was 598 people ago.
Yeah,
photographers.
Yeah.
Ago. Congratulations on
thank you.
Amazing body of work you've done for, as you know, from my past history and photography. Get together in very close ways in my work and the stories I do and the people that I interview. And so to see your body of work along the same lines, and you've gone further with recording this high fidelity, these voices that one day will be gone, the photos will live on, but it's amazing to have the voices to go along with it.
Yeah, thank you. Because, when I interviewed you, I was still trying to figure this whole thing out. I didn't know what the hell I was doing.
I was within the first 3 or 4.
Yeah, that's right.
I think. Yeah. So thank you for having me back.
Oh, my pleasure, man.
For sure.
I've always been, I've enjoyed your work. I enjoyed working with you back in the old magazine days.
That's right. I love that too. It's scary to think about how fast time goes. I mean, that's like 30 years ago or something.
Yeah.
Or is it not that far? Am I?
No, it's getting there. Probably not 30, but probably at 25.
Yeah.
Yeah. Something like that 20, 25 years ago. I'm not going to look in the calendar to find out exactly.
No, but you're like Dorian Gray. You're ageless,
Oh yeah.
I'm feeling, actually, I'm not feeling it at all. I feel great. I think I'm looking it, but not feeling it.
Yeah. When I decided to grow out the beard and you see all the gray there, going, oh yeah.
No, but that looks distinguished and stuff. I just, but I'm doing, we're out there still. And, there's a lot more ahead, I think. And so if we look back, from the last time we talked till now, a lot of water has flowed under the bridge, I think, for both of us. And I think I have a lot of new books out. I don't know what I had out at that time.
Yeah, because I think the last time I talked to you was the book on North Korea. I think that's the last book that we discussed on the show.
Right. So that would have been 2000. Wow, 2008. No, what am I saying? 2013 was the last, the second North Korea book. We might have talked when the first North Korea book came out, but I did that book, North Korea, based on it being the 60th anniversary of the signing of the armistice that stopped the war, didn't end it. Mm-hmm. You know, we're still technically in a state of war with North Korea. I always, or I shouldn't say always, but I often was, we look for hooks for stories and projects and things. Sometimes something happens and that becomes the story. Like, I've done a lot of work in Japan. Well, for many years with the way the Japanese bath, which I love, but then the tsunami happened in 2011. And I've been, following that story. I was there just after the tsunami. I had been there just before, actually in the exact place where the tsunami came in. Ironically enough, just 3 months before that happened. And so then I returned to a very different place, that was completely devastated, but so impressive to see how the people, reacted to that. And so there's always, hooks for stories and so North Korea was that 60th anniversary, and so one after another, stories come out based on either what's going on or an anniversary, something that happened in the past, or at least that's how I approach, stories.
Well, your career is really a fascinating and unique one from my perspective, because your work is so diverse in terms of what you've covered throughout your career, and largely it's been self-propelled. Certainly, you've worked mm-hmm. for magazines, but so much of what you've done has been initiated by you, and the fact that you've had as fruitful and as lengthy a career as you have is quite the testament, to a lot of things. Not least of which is your talent as a photographer. But I think it's a sort of fortitude that doesn't come easy, because there's a lot of struggle involved. And I know that you drew a lot of inspiration from your dad, who despite some physical disabilities, including having had survived through polio. Yeah. I suspect that you probably picked up a lot of being able to overcome, whatever challenges in order to make things happen. Do you kind of attribute what you've been able to do by what you observed your dad being able to achieve?
Well, I wouldn't even say kind of. I would say 100% did, and I appreciate you being so aware of that connection there, because 100%. I mean, I grew up in a house where there were never any excuses for anything, because it was just by example. I mean, here's a guy who just had the use of one arm. His backbone was very curved, but yet he could somehow walk. I mean, we'd go play golf and he would use, one club as a cane and hit with one hand. And he actually could almost shoot even par on a par 3, which is just unbelievable. And then we would play fungo, baseball in the street, and he would throw up the ball with one hand, holding the bat, and then hit. It was just unbelievable what he could do. And that's just on, on our personal side. In the business world, he worked with magazines and TV doing promotion, and was incredibly successful and traveled the world, and actually was a very serious photographer, sometimes for work, doing like for KCBS radio in San Francisco, doing PR. He would shoot. And so you grow up in that environment. First of all, I sort of was his assistant when we would do family trips. And so I was out, shooting the camera. And so when I would shoot photos with him and my mom and brother in a shot, I would get the camera. And so I grew up in a family that had, 8mm film cameras and 35 millimeter still cameras, and actually I think maybe early on even a 2.25. But growing up with somebody like that was such a great inspiration, for sure. But also, he was a very creative person as well. And my mom was a singer in her youth, and then got into working, she was a teacher. She went back to school when I was maybe 10 years old. And so I saw, my mom go back and get her teaching degree at Cal State LA. So I sort of grew up in an environment where people just got out and did things. So I attribute so much to both my mother and father. And I didn't know I couldn't do something when I was younger. Like, I wanted to build a studio out of the garage when I was 14, and he let me, get the lumber and put in a floor and stuff. It's like, wow, that's really rolling the dice. I don't know how many parents would let you, potentially destroy something, but actually it worked out really well. And to this day, that floor doesn't creak at all that I put in on a very uneven surface. And that's, I still feel good about that. I mean, it's I don't live there anymore, but I know that floor is still intact. But because my mom, who unfortunately is not doing very well, but she still is in that house, and so at least the ceiling we put up is sort of collapsed, but you can't win them all. So yeah, but the floor is still working.
Yeah, but that idea, that principle is like, you don't know you can't do something until you try to do it.
That's right.
And I think that's something that seems to have been instilled in you by your parents, because I see it reflected in everything you're doing, of just the fact that you are learning all these different languages. You've studied Japanese, you're studying Chinese, and God knows whatever else. And the idea that it's like, you're studying all these languages sometimes simultaneously, and the idea that is just like, how can you do it? And it's like, well, how do you know you can't do it?
It's true. No, very well said. Yeah, I really grew up, and I still have that to this day. The idea of, I grew up, wanting to be a baseball player, and I didn't really close that door until, for fun, a couple of friends and I went to an open tryout for the Giants, I think when we were all 25.
Oh, wow.
We had to open a bottle of champagne the night before. I think we knew what the results were going to be, but they were very gracious. The Giants, we flew out to Arizona and we did it. And it really did mentally sort of just close the book. And so I do like to, just follow, feelings, and not let the super ego get involved too much and think too much and think, you can't do this because. Well, I've never been big on excuses, even when I teach, workshops or whatever. And then somebody starts to say, I couldn't do this because, in fact, the famous quote by a National Geographic editor about we publish pictures, not excuses.
Yeah,
is such a great quote, and I think almost anything you can find a way to achieve something within reasons. There are blockades, mental and physical, that can get in the way, but more often than not, they're mental more than physical. And so let's at least try to get up against that barrier and see if we could break through, rather than just turning around with an excuse.
Is that how you kind of face challenges or adversity? Is not so much thinking about, why you're under these circumstances or how difficult it's going to be, but you see it rather as, well, let me try and figure this out, rather than getting enmeshed in all sort of the emotions of self-doubt and insecurity. Is that how you think you're hardwired?
Definitely. That doesn't mean I'm not full of anxiety over things, but I do believe that one door closes, another opens, to use an old expression. But it's so true. It is so true. You just have to be, open to it, and it's not easy. But it's also so to go back to a person who really inspired me as well when I still do interviews with photographers. But Eve Arnold, many years ago, we were talking. I visited her in England, and we did a feature, and she said, maybe there's a news story happening. I don't know if you can hear it. There's a siren outside. So maybe, not that I'm an ambulance chaser, but you never know if there's something. But Eve Arnold, when we were together in London, said that, as a freelancer, you're either waiting for the phone to ring or you're overwhelmed with work and trying to juggle things. And so she started doing, book projects. So in China was one of them, her first really big long-term project. And she said that really sort of smoothed out the edges. So she made a conscious decision. I mean, besides producing a really amazing book at a time that very few Western photographers, were able to, shoot in China. Mark Rabu is an exception to that as well. Because she was living in England, and I believe her husband was English, so she had English citizenships. She was able to, I believe that's the case. She was able to maneuver easier in China, and but that whole concept of being freelance and looking for long-term projects. That had an effect on me as well. And I see that, with Marielle and Mark, we talked about how she came up with projects. I mean, if you look at her greatest, work, it's almost always something that she came up with, right. Or, she worked on Streetwise. Her husband was shooting, a documentary, and then I think she was doing stills. Then she just really ran with it. But I mean, if you look at Indian Circus that she did, one project after another, she came up with it. The twins, mm-hmm. So if you wait around for the phone to ring to this day, or I guess these days for a text or something, the phone hardly ever rings except for spam, right? These days. But if you wait around for somebody to give you something, you're going to be waiting more often than not a lot longer than you should be for really interesting projects. And also, if you want something to come from within, I mean, Salgado is another great example, right? Where he might get a call from Kathy Ryan saying, "Hey, why don't you do this or that?" In fact, that happened to cover the war in Iraq, and he decided, you know what? Let's wait and see the aftermath and what's going on here. With the global impact of the oil wells burning untapped and all this other stuff, and he came out with a very deep, important project that was much more where he was coming from, the bigger impact of something than a more reportage documentary on the actual fighting.
Yeah. I think so much of your career is along the sort of same lines in terms of knowing who you are as a photographer, the stories you want to tell, and how you want to tell them. Yeah. And I think that photographers like Marielle and Mark and Salgado are really good examples of people with that sort of set of mindset. And I think you have that as well, especially when I think about, when you got your master's degree, you basically sort of formulated your degree in terms of it being, a photographic history degree where, the Cal State School where you went didn't have that.
That's right.
But you knew what you wanted to do was sort of a hybrid of studying history, but also being able to use a camera in order to capture the story, the history of whatever subject matter or event that you were interested in focusing on. And I think just the fact that you had that insight then tells me that you already knew the path that you needed to be on in order to make the career fit you, rather than you trying to fit what you thought the career was.
Yeah. That is so well said, and I appreciate you connecting all those dots. Sometimes I forget, but it's really true. So yeah, the exact title for what I came up with, and they signed Dean Suzuki. I still remember who signed off on it. At Cal State LA, which was a very commuter sort of school, but it was perfect. But they had great programs, but nothing really fit for exactly what I wanted to do. And so to marry photography and history and some other and filmmaking and so it was called it was a special major, pictorial documentary history, and it really did tie in my interests. I think I was still, when I came out of Cal State Northridge with the history major, I was still very lost. I had taken some photo classes and I loved it, but I really had no clue about how to take that interest and love and make it a career at all. And I did love travel, as I obviously still do. And so I got a job first with the travel company to package tours. And so that was at a time of telexes or whatever they call it. And I might be dating myself that maybe there was a newer word, but I think we were dealing with getting tours in and out of China, which was not easy in the early 80s. But I think that major, I did have an inkling of where I wanted to go, not necessarily how I wanted to go. And that major, I think, really helped. And my master's thesis was on Boston's historic sites and the interpretations used to convey the sense of history for which they stand. And I think that really set some things up that I realized really worked a few years later. First of all, it gave me a higher level of research methodology. But then when I did my first book about photographies, the faces of the 20th century master photographers and their work, I kept thinking, this isn't that hard to put a book together. And I was with Abbeville Press. I had a great editor there, which of course smoothed the way. But assembling everything for it was not that difficult, because having done my master's thesis was basically, it was an extension of the same thing. And so I don't think I realized for maybe 15, 16 years after I got that degree, how clearly it paid off in terms of understanding the methodology of how to do things. But I always, I hear about an anniversary, or I'm struck by something, and then I run with it, and then I might get to the point and say, okay, this doesn't quite work. I mean, just like I was in Ukraine in December, and I went in with sort of a couple of different loose concepts, but there was something that really struck me. And it actually, believe it or not, came out of orangutans, which sounds like a strange thing to connect with Ukraine and the current situation there. But after doing my book about orangutans, I found that there were a couple of orangutans still in Ukraine during the war, and some were being moved. There was a horrible incident at this eco park near Kharkiv, where a lot of animals, horrible, just slaughter of animals as the Russians were coming in, and that sort of led to a bigger story about the people that were doing animal rescues in Ukraine and really risking their lives going into. And I went in with somebody who was. They rescue all sorts of animals. That particular day, they were focused on cats, and so we went about 2 kilometers from the Russian border to a place called Vovchansk, and mortars, or not mortars, but those incoming rounds. It was shelling, and I really thought about, wow, this person is doing this over and over again, to save animals. And that was really impressive. So that's how one sort of story leads to another. And then I did the research on it. And that's how so that master's degree and that interest in history and research. So it's not just about, okay, here's a story here, but, how did the situation in Ukraine get to that situation? So understanding the history behind that. And then in June, I had done another story. I was in Odessa very briefly, and I came up through Moldova. But understanding the history of the area, I'm not an expert at all on Eastern Europe, but having a working knowledge, I think, does give more insight and more depth to a story you produce when you have a fairly good idea of how we got to a certain place, instead of just taking some. And if you look at all W. Gene Smith, what he did, for his photo essays, you can see in his imagery, a deep understanding of what he's doing, and also the time he put in. Like you're going over to Japan again soon, in Minamata, when he did his landmark, probably his last big photo essay, actually, but Minamata, you can see the depth that he went to create that. You see an understanding of the situation in his images. And, his wife, Eileen, obviously was a huge help, to that, to help bridge the gap. But even without that, I think, he didn't speak, Japanese, the humanism and the connecting with other humans, I think, is what was probably a more important language for him to use for communication.
Yeah. Speaking of the work that you did in the Ukraine, 40 years ago, you would have contacted a magazine editor, told them the story, and then they would have hired you to go out and tell the story. You get they pay for the flights and help you to help make whatever arrangements, and you get out there, and you're assured that more than likely the work that you would produce there would get published. That's not the case anymore. You kind of just go out on your own and make it happen. So walk us through what your process is, especially for this most recent project that you just mentioned, from hearing about what's happening and then putting everything in motion in order to get there, produce the images, and come back safely with the pictures and do something with them.
Right. Well, in that case, for Ukraine, I'd started working. I met with the folks who run Zuma Press at the Tokyo Olympics. Actually, I was shooting in Tokyo for Newsweek, but I met the folks from Zuma Press and got started working with them, and then did the Beijing Olympics and Paralympics with them, including in the Paralympics the Ukraine team. And I was in Beijing when the Russians started the invasion, and it was a big debate about, well, should the Russian and Belarusian Paralympic teams be allowed to participate? So the Olympics were done already, and then the invasion started. And then there's a question about, was the timing of the invasion purposely sort of, they waited until the Russians waited until, or Putin waited until after the Olympics to start it. That was a very real debate, but it did start just before the Paralympics. And at first, the Paralympic Committee said, we are going to keep the teams here. These Paralympians shouldn't be punished by the sins of their country. And then there was such an uproar by the other teams that there was a news conference, which I attended and I photographed, where they reversed the decision and said, no, we have to send the other teams are saying we're going to leave if the Russians and Belarusians stay. And so I covered that. And so sort of my first coverage of the whole issue, the whole war, in a sense, starts in Beijing at this press conference. And I did talk to some of the Ukrainian coaches there. I photographed. I then started to focus more on the Ukrainian Paralympians and photograph them. And so I think that was where the idea started to incubate that I should go to Ukraine at some point and maybe follow the Paralympian story there. I ended up, when I got there, well, first of all, yeah, and you're 100% right. I funded everything myself. Zuma was a way to get images out, but it was in order to get press credentials to use Zuma Press was something I needed to do. And so that's like the one part of it, because you want to work legally there. Mm-hmm. You're in a war zone. You want to show the proper ID and all that. So I bought a ticket, got myself to Warsaw, and took the train in from there to Kyiv, across the border, and then started to meet with people, and then ideas started to come. And so first I started doing a little more general news thing, and then I started to pursue the ideas, especially with the orangutans. Could I meet and photograph the orangutans you have in captivity? And then I heard about this eco park that had been destroyed, and I got out to Kharkiv, but also had heard about. Sorry about that. I thought I had turned that off. So I heard about in Kharkiv and this Feldman Eco Park and the Kyiv Zoo, the Kyiv Zoo I went to, but then the Eco Park in Kharkiv and the Kharkiv Zoo, and then this Ukraine animals organization that was doing rescues. And so more and more I started to move that direction. So I didn't pursue the Ukrainian Paralympian stories back there. That doesn't mean I won't, but I really ran with this story, besides just doing some general, news when things would happen, because, of course, in a war area, it's a very, very fluid situation. And then I went with it and have gotten the photos out, and there's been a lot of response to it. I came face to face with the animals that had survived because of humans. So often we hear stories about how humans are destroying animals, but there's a lot of good humans out there that are trying to help their fellow beings. And I had the good fortune to work with some of them, and they're really courageous people. But animals get very stressed. There's an elephant at the Kharkiv Zoo that during the heaviest of bombing had to be put on extreme tranquilizers. It's not that easy just to move animals, and so even though Kharkiv's far away from, Kharkiv is about 30 miles from the Russian border. And Kyiv is obviously much further away, fortunately now. But the elephant at the Kyiv Zoo had to be very heavily tranquilized. One of the keepers slept in the same area with the elephant, and that elephant actually learned every time it heard a siren and it was outside, it would come inside to its enclosure on its own. So in other words, animals, like, they don't understand the concept of war per se, but they understand that when they hear a siren, in this case, that there could be followed by explosions. It's just incredible to see. We might be capable of having a broader understanding of what's going on. and I don't know if that eases anything, but just imagine if you're an animal and you have no clue about what's going on, but you're hearing these explosions, or in the case of the Feldman Zoo, all these animals being killed around you. I mean, what terror that must be.
Yeah. The idea of going into a war zone to make photographs is not a decision you can make lightly. I know that we tend to romanticize, the grizzled war correspondent, the idea of someone going out there and just being blindly dedicated to telling the story. But I'm wondering for you, why is it important for you to make the choice to make photographs even under those kind of life-threatening conditions? Because you don't have to. You're under no obligation to do that. So why do you think you choose to do that?
Well, I'm really not putting myself in the line of fire, particularly. I mean, you see such amazing photographers that are out there that are really, doing that on a constant basis. Being in Kyiv at this time is of course the sirens go off and things come in, but the odds are you won't be at the place where it does. That doesn't mean it won't. Getting out to Kharkiv and then to Volchansk was definitely a different ball game because stuff was coming in all over, and so that was. But the border regions, I was there in such a relatively short amount of time compared to what people that are covering the frontline stuff. It's just where the story took me, and also like North Korea, going there 10 times or Iran twice. There's no fighting going on in North Korea. There was no fighting going on in Iran. In Iraq, I was doing something on an area that got us within 17 kilometers of some very heavy fighting, but the story really was not focused on a fighting area there. And so it's really more that I happen to be in areas that are in conflict, either where I think there's an important story, but I'm not covering battlefield things per se. It's just that these stories happen to be in these areas of conflict. I mean, the same could be said in a sense for Borneo with the orangutans and the palm oil thing. There's a war going on in a sense that the orangutans and the other animals in the forest there could be the victims, but it's also a very complicated issue. And I like to look deeper into that with people are trying to survive there too. And so, palm oil plantations. So I see my stories in a way sort of jump around too. But I think it's easier because I don't have kids. I'm not married anymore. And so it's really just me in a sense. And so I think if you're married and have kids, you have to think more about putting yourself in places that are of higher risk, for sure. I mean, if you had young kids and you're putting yourself out there, you really have to think about, is this a wise move? I have no interest in being killed in a war zone or any place else. I really enjoy life too much, but I also think it's really important to get these stories out. And I do ask myself the question, if not now, when? And also, will I regret it if I don't do it? That's very often. In fact, that's the key one. Will I regret it if I don't do it? And so very seldom is the answer, no, I won't regret it. Almost always, if I start to formulate an idea about a project, and I start to sort of feel that inkling, I want to do this, I let the inner voice sort of, dictate. And of course, the super ego once again can come in and come up with some excuses or reasons. And I think you do have to listen to that for preservation. But I think you still have to, I think the more overriding one, every time I get on a plane and go to North Korea, as an American, as I said, nobody's, there's no active shooting at all, but there's a potential for being held. But I think from my experiences there, if you're straightforward and you follow the rules, you usually end up coming out in good shape.
Yeah. Well, that answers kind of, I think, answers the question I was going to ask you next,
yep.
Which is, when you're thinking about the potential of something that you want to do,
yep.
A lot of this stuff is, much of it, your work is so self-funded, and
yep.
and thinking about, well, how viable is this? I may be inclined to want to do this, but there are a lot of ideas that may pop into your head of things to do, right? And the thing is, you still, and even if you don't have a family, you still have, a roof over your head. You still have to pay your bills. You still have to pay your insurance. And there are a lot of practical things that you have to consider, which I think is what keeps a lot of people from not doing it. Because they go, I can't take a risk of spending all this money and not getting a return on it. But if you're asking yourself ultimately that question, will I regret not doing it? That may answer the choice to do it, even though you may be unsure about the outcome, which I think is sort of a perilous place for a lot of people to be. So my question to you is, does your inclination to follow that come from having a history of making that choice and having it work out, both
Definitely.
creatively and financially and career wise?
Well, financially, no. Sometimes, no, for sure. If I'm looking at things in a purely or really using that as a big part of the equation. First of all, I do look at obviously we all have to look at economics for sure. And that's actually a second part of, not being, married anymore or, having kids is so the finances pretty much is just about my own, personal survival economically. And I do have to think about that. And I do take it in. Ukraine has not been, one would say, economically viable. If I look at it in a very, linear sort of way, though, I might have been asked to do a workshop or something because of that. Don't know if that's happened yet. I do workshops all the time. I don't know if somebody said, Mark just did this. Why don't we have him do that? That happens all the time. But all my projects, if I look at, the way the Japanese bath, my Japanese bath book has paid off 10 times. At least, but in a lot of non-linear ways. In other words, okay, if we look at straight book sales, I think now we're almost at, it's its third edition, almost 6,000 books out, and there's print sales about that. And so but I'm also, asked to be a speaker all the time about that. So many magazines have done features on the book, a lot of in-flight magazines. I've done, so many other stories for Backroads. I did a whole campaign for them, which is a travel company in the Noto Peninsula in Japan. But of course, that goes into my being able to speak conversational Japanese. I just came back from doing something with Abercrombie and Kent in Japan. I'm going back for the Adventure Trade World Summit. So that's paid off on so many levels besides a personal fulfillment level. North Korea, a lot of exhibitions, a lot of features on the work. That work, a lot of it's through Getty Images. That stuff goes out. But the motivation for any of those stories has never been economics. But I do have to think in terms of economic survival for sure. And so I do think about, eating at home rather than going to restaurants and things like that. In other words, it's just sort of like, where does the money go? And I love restaurants and things, but I do have to, get down to, and I love the expression realpolitik way of looking at things, not the way I hope them to be, but the way they really are. Mm-hmm. is my approach, even, when I study photography. But if you take that on a life lesson in terms of how to deal with finances, I think I've done well, because it's like, okay, the reality is, this is how much I've got. This can go to that, but you got to roll the dice, and the clock, is ticking, for all of us, right? And so we're only here once, as far as I know, and so might as well use the time as much as we can. And so, I continue to follow the stories that mean something, and also realize that, especially because, as you mentioned earlier, I'm in so many sort of different genres of photography. It does get confusing to people. Am I a wildlife photographer? Am I a portrait photographer? Am I a documentary photographer? An art photographer? And maybe just the answer is yes, which doesn't make sense to say yeah, but that's probably, yeah. And it's good. But what I do, and I've learned to sort of cubbyhole stuff. And so when I do stuff on Instagram, I try to put bodies of work up. If every day it's a different, image, like one day it's, today's, sometimes I'll cut a story short because there's a particular anniversary happening, and I'll put up an image. But just like when we do a magazine feature and it's 12 to 8 images, it's on a particular subject. And I, maybe from the magazine days when we were doing that together, I really understand that it's just not, you just don't have this retrospective approach, with magazines. You have a story approach, you have a hook. And so somebody might be an amazing photographer and has done this work all over the world, but when we do features, we usually look for a hook. Did they just have a book come out, and then we feature work on that particular subject matter? And then maybe when somebody's older, you might do a retrospective sort of feature on somebody. And so I have that same approach. Just like, you're going to Japan and you're going to be doing some great street work. But when we look at that body of work, it's clear that this is a body of work. You're not trying to take on all of Japan, right?
Yeah.
Right. You're focusing on street life, like in, where you going?
Osaka and Kyoto.
Oh, great. Perfect. And so what's your focus there, actually?
It's largely being defined by George, because he's Japanese. Yeah. So he has a lot of cultural insight into the society and the communities that we're going to be exploring. So he kind of handles that, and I kind of handle the way of being able to see and interpret that with the camera. So like my first trip to Tokyo, it was basically, I was kind of like on the workshop myself, because I was learning so much about Japanese culture that I had no idea about. The social dynamics with people, behavior, cultural norms, finding ways of not offending people unintentionally. So for me, it was that's one of the fascinating things about visiting the place, and why I'm really kind of eager to kind of return there after having cut my teeth on it once. It's like there's so much more to learn and look forward to, and have experiences that are very unlike anything that I've had before.
Oh, that's interesting.
And the fact that I get to make photographs on top of that is just like gravy.
Oh, it's unbelievable. And it's going to be amazing to see what you come up with there. I mean, Japan really is still on the top of my, list. Sorry, something. How did that just happen? Wow, that's crazy. We're talking about Japan, and all of a sudden, my music thing went on. That was strange. Okay, so we'll take it. Okay, here we go.
But
not that it was a bad song, but so the Japan is still at the top of my list as favorite places to explore. I just love Japan. My ex-wife, and we're still super close, is Japanese. And every time I teach a workshop there, she does a tea ceremony for us. She went back for an amazing job with TV Tokyo, but she then followed her passion and her love of the Japanese tea ceremony. So if you're in Tokyo, I would love to connect you guys.
Yeah, I would love that.
Yeah. Japanese tea ceremony is just so, the mindfulness aspect, the being in the present, the grace of it. It's not about drinking tea, but I love Japanese culture. And so instead of, and sort of, this might sort of expand upon something we talked about earlier. So instead of trying to do something on all Japan and Japan culture, it's too vague. The way of the Japanese bath, about the whole Japanese onsen, the hot spring experience, comes out of that idea of looking for something that tells a bigger story, but is focused on one thing. I mean, you have the great work of Michael Kenna, who is interpreting Japan with its landscapes and beauties, and that's sort of a different way of doing it. And you're probably going to then do more like sort of street and life and people and reality things. The Japanese bath, I mean, I've done probably 4 or 5 major focused bodies of work in Japan, but the way the Japanese bath is one of them. The Tokyo Olympics, I call that the Miracle Games, because and then I took that and the Chinese, the Beijing Olympics, put those together as the Miracle Games, because I mean, the concept of bringing the world together during a pandemic is unbelievable, and to do it successfully. And so that was that body of work. 3/11, which is March 11th, which is when the tsunami, the earthquake and the tsunami was, and that's now been I guess we're going on 12 years, is a continuing project that I'm doing, to trace, to use my images from just after the tsunami and just before, and then the recovery, which I've been every time I go to Japan, I go back up to that area and I generate some stories, which is, run in, do we say ran or run? It ran?
It ran.
I guess I could say it ran.
Yeah.
It ran in Vanity Fair and all these other, magazines, and then through stock. But once again, has that paid off on a linear way? I think it's more nonlinear, because, I did that. And then that was one of the first big stories I did for Vanity Fair. And then soon after, I met Pico Iyer, who's an amazing writer, and we teamed up and did something in North Korea for Vanity Fair. And so you see that non-linear way. In other words, if I didn't have that initial association with Vanity Fair because of the tsunami, I wouldn't have, or actually I knew David Friend from Life magazine. So I had an association with some of the people who had moved over to Vanity Fair, but definitely it was the success of that coverage helped with the North Korea story, being able to connect with Pico and do the big feature on North Korea cinema, which was the focus of that particular story. So it's always an interesting thing. Yeah, do things pay off? And so my, I guess, standard answer might be, I think, in a non-linear way. Yeah. And same actually North Korea with you're friends with Farmani as well, of course, from IPA, International Photography Awards. I think Hussein Farmani. But my book on North Korea won the photo book of the year And then he recommended me, along with Steve McCurry and 2 other photographers, to do the Turkey advertising campaign for 2014. And so that, so did North Korea pay off directly in terms of the features? I mean, it definitely has paid off on a personal level in terms of my, fascination with history and what I feel is important to document. But, that one job doing the advertising campaign for Turkey, which was a direct result of the book, financially paid off. So that's why I can sit here with some books behind me and, get out and pursue the other projects.
When it comes to our finances, many things make demands on us. Housing, food, electricity, healthcare, so many things. There is no getting around the fact that whatever we earn goes to these essentials. And after all these things are taken care of, we hopefully have enough left to spend on things that make our lives enjoyable and better, including a lovely night out, a vacation, or even just a good book. There is no shortage of people and institutions asking you to support their work. We're no exception. But I believe that the people who support our show do so because we bring something unique and special to their lives. And when they do that, they are helping to make it possible for countless others, some of whom may never be able to afford to support the show financially. Yet they benefit from these 600 plus episodes and these wonderful conversations. If you can afford to and believe that what we do is important and that more people should know about it, please become a Patreon supporter today. You can contribute $5, $10, $20 or more a month by visiting patreon.com/thecandidframe. I have and continue to do this show because I believe in its mission completely. If you do so as well, please become a supporter today. Thanks. Let's talk about the people of the forest, which is one of your more recent books on orangutans. How did that all come about?
I had submitted some photos just that I had done in, of all places, Indianapolis. You wouldn't necessarily think that the start of a project on orangutans would start in Indianapolis, but that's exactly where it did. And it's not because orangutans are indigenous to Indianapolis. They're only in Borneo and Sumatra, but they have an incredible international orangutan center there. And I was on a press trip to Indianapolis that happened to coincide with the opening of this international center years ago. And I was so fascinated by the orangutans. I knew so little about them before this trip, and probably not that much in immediate aftermath. But I started really doing my homework. But when I photographed them at this opening, we had sort of special access. They were still on the other side of a glass partition. But I used an off-camera flash, which I could drop down the background, so it basically went black, and it was more of a portrait rather than an environmental. It was eyes are the window to the soul portrait rather than an environmental portrait of them in this enclosure. And I know this sounds crazy, but one of them asked with gestures to look at the back of my screen to see the photo. And I turned the camera around and they looked at it. They didn't sign off on it. They didn't seem to have a like, maybe they didn't like it, but I was blown away by that. And since then, I've actually seen some video from the same place where a woman had bandages over a burn she had on her shoulder. And one of the orangutans kept gesturing, wanting to see what it was. I mean, obviously they're, sentient beings, but there's just so much. And so I started to, with just those first couple of photos, I started getting a reaction to those few photos I did at this opening, and I think it was 2014 or 2017, but very early on. And then I arranged to go back, and this time, bring more, strobes instead of just, an off-camera, Nikon speed light, and really produced. In fact, the cover photo of the book was produced on that second session when I went back and really brought lights that I could overpower. I had pro photo lights that I could, overpower the ambient light completely and really move around and shoot. And so that was really the beginning of it. And then I found out about in Florida a rescue center for chimpanzees and orangutans, but I still focused on orangutans, once again, not getting too broad. And then I submitted to the Sony contest, and those photos were published all over the world, and won some awards. And then somebody in Switzerland for the Borneo Orangutan Survival Foundation saw those in a magazine and then contacted me and asked, would I do a pro bono thing for them in Borneo, which I agreed to do. And so that's when it really started going. And then I've shot also at the Tamazu, shot in Singapore, because the portraits, for the most part, are in controlled environments. I'm not going to use a strobe out in the wild. In Borneo, I used Stella lights, which are now so powerful, so we wouldn't startle the animals at this rescue center. The animals in enclosures, in zoos, I got permission to use it. And just like us, it's not going to hurt our eyes, a strobe. It's not going to hurt theirs. But of course, an animal in the wild, I'm not going to change his or her behavior or anything by trying to do something like that in a wild situation. So I did more, the typical wildlife sort of photography when I wanted to photograph animals in the wild to tell part of the story. So the first part of the book are the orangutans in the wild. But then I interviewed experts on, behavior, and learned, animal behavior. And I learned so much from them. And so that, once again, that's how it sort of germinated. And then in Australia at the big photo festival there, they made these gigantic prints. In Switzerland, we had a big exhibition. We're going to have a couple next year. And so, I sort of just go with, once again, it still comes back to that same thing. I'm not going to wait for a commitment like, oh, yeah, this is going to be published or we're going to pay for you to do this or that. I roll the dice, all the time, and follow something. And then I've also then sort of used that technique up in a PR person said, hey, what you did with the orangutans, would you be willing to do that with these dogs and cats at this rescue center in Wisconsin where they're unwanted because of these horrible things that have happened to them? They're not adoptable. And so they have a home for life. And that's actually the name of the organization. And so I did a pro bono thing, for them, which is incredibly rewarding to do. And I mean, the backstories of these animals, so it's just, horrible, two of them, were shot in the face, just one thing after, another. But I do think with the camera, we can make a difference, and
yeah, because I think the book, I love the portraits, but the text, I learned so much about the palm oil industry in Borneo and how that's impacting their habitat. The communication abilities of the orangutans and the social dynamics. I mean, just from the brief text in your book, I learned so much. And so thank you for that. Yeah. But I think,
no, thank you.
But I think that's one of the things that makes what you do, the way you do it, really effective, is that it's not just about the photographs. The photographs are certainly important, but the story and the context also is.
100%. That's so well said. I mean, right. Just like, you look at Minamata always is sort of my go-to example. of that, the words, or I should say the backstories and how we got to that place. Not just, we just can't deal. Okay, yes, you're dealing with the present, but how did we get here?
Mm-hmm.
That is such an important thing, because then we can really make responsible decisions about now what can we do about it. And that's everything. Whether people are focused on doing stories about gun control or reproductive rights or whatever. We've got to look at the big picture to understand how did we get here, and then make an informed decision. And so I think, photographs lead us on a story, along a good path, but I think we still need words, to get to the finish line of whatever we need to, focus on for the depth. And you could see horrible photos of what's going on in Ukraine, but without an understanding of how did this situation develop, how could we make an informed decision about it, what can we do about it? I don't have the answer, even though I might have be informed. This is really tough, the one over there. I do have some thoughts about how it could end, but that's it means the end of some leaders. I don't know any other way out, but who knows?
You've produced how many books now? I think it's at least a half a dozen.
Well, I think, let's see. The first book was Faces of the 20th Century, about master photographers. Then Wanderlust, and we had 2 editions of that. Then now we have 3 editions of The Way of the Japanese Bath. Then I did, for Chronicle books, Inside North Korea and Inside Iran. Then I did South Korea, North Korea for the 60th anniversary. Then a book, a how-to book called with Focal Press, called The Travel Photo Essay Describing a Journey Through Images. And then the orangutan book, The People of the Forest, which, by the way, the word orangutan, right, breaks down as the people of the forest. And so people saw the connections, in Indonesia and Malaysia, obviously centuries ago. So I really should count that up at some point. So, and I guess it depends, and also there's international, there's foreign language editions of some of the books. So,
because it's
maybe closer to 10 or something.
Wow. Yeah. And having been able to produce, books throughout most of your career, is quite the accomplishment, especially now as the book industry has changed, making it even more difficult for a photographer to put out a body of work. So, after all of these experiences, what do you think is one of the more valuable insights that you gained in terms of getting your book published that you feel now is absolutely essential to making it happen, at least for yourself?
Well, I think having a clear story is the key. Nowadays, my books are printed in a traditional manner. In other words, when I guess what you call offset printing, I should know the proper word for it. But and they're printed in China. Last book was printed in Korea. Not sure where Abbeville Press. Maybe they did in Italy and Chronicle. Can't quite remember where. But nowadays, like with companies like Blurb, people can do one-off books and then have it for sale. And so I would say to people, if they're interested in sort of softly getting into the book world, they might want to do something that direction. There's also contests where people can submit projects, for and they might be able to get a publisher that way. I would say, going to book festivals, talking to people, going to Barnes and Noble and looking at who is printing what. In other words, Fiden might be doing one type of book while Taschen is doing another, while Chronicles is doing one. I mean, there's still a lot of great publishers out there, but so you can go and shop things around, put a book dummy together. You could even with Blurb make a book dummy and then shop that around, or it could just end with making a book at a place like Blurb and then selling it there, and then you don't have to have the huge investment. But the key is, no matter if you want to pursue a book, I've known from very early on it has to be focused. So I teach a lot of workshops, focused on the concept of the photo essay, telling a story through images, and that once again, I guess, sort of ties into my interest in history and understanding, just like with my going way back now to my master's thesis on Boston's historic sites. Focused body of work is what gets out there. And you go to any galleryist and they'll tell you the same thing. And of course, they often base their shows on a new book coming out. And so that's another, aspect of it. So they all sort of fit in together. I think the one thing that people probably should avoid is trying to just do stuff as a greatest hits approach. Like here's the work I've done in France. France is not a story, right? France is a location. Mm-hmm. Get in there. What's interesting there? Japan is not a story. It's what's interesting in there. And so you get in there to the Japanese bath, the tsunami, the hiking the Nakasendo, which are magazine stories. Obviously, I'm doing a lot more magazine stories every time there's a concept rather than a book. But definitely the key is have it focused and let a retrospective be in the waning years of your career or life. But in the meantime, put bodies of work together. So I guess I'm sort of changing the question more to suggestions than based on my personal experience. But
it seems like you answered that in terms of having a focus rather than just sort of a broad collection of what you think are your best photographs.
Exactly. And you still can have that, but really that should be more for the retrospective age, rather than the path toward that. You look at one after another, and I think people can look at their own favorite photographers, people that like who are some of you? I don't know if you're allowed to say because you've interviewed so many people, but I guess you're still allowed to have your favorites, right? Yeah. And say who they are. Like, who are some of the people that you look at?
Oh God, it's the different people for different reasons. Like Gordon Parks is always on the top of my list just because he's an amazing photographer. But I think part of like you, he did so many things because he didn't know he couldn't do them, and so that's one of the things. That's my big why I love his life and his career so much, because he was a photographer, he was a filmmaker, he was a composer. He did so many different things, and he had no training on them. He just went, well, let me try and write a novel, and he wrote a novel. And, so, there's Bill Allard. Yeah. What he could do with Kodachrome was just jaw dropping to me.
I agree with you.
He was a photographer working with 64, 200 ISO film. And he would create images under circumstances that many people would have said, well, you can't make pictures here.
Yeah.
And he would find a way to do it. And the images would be just remarkable. So I think just those two off the top of my head are people who didn't allow supposed limitations to keep them from doing what they were inclined to do, especially
100%.
creatively. So I think that when I think about it, that any of the photographers who I sort of gravitate to have that spirit about them. And it manifests itself in a variety of different ways. But I think that's probably the consistent through line for
100%.
Love most.
Yeah. And I was, fortunate to know Gordon, and he's in my first book. I don't know if you've seen my portrait of him and so he was telling me the story about when he went to Life magazine. And he came from Fort Lawrence, Kansas.
Yeah, Kansas.
And now there's a museum there. But when he was growing up, the prejudice and all the stuff that he had to go through is unbelievable. Now there's a museum at the community. Oh, Fort Scott. I'm sorry.
That's right. Fort Scott. Yeah.
Fort Scott. But what he had to go up against is unbelievable. And I guess yet unfortunately believable. But when he went to Life magazine, he almost got tossed out, not because he was black, but because it's like, you just can't walk into Life magazine with a portfolio. And he had already shot some fashion stuff by then, and also the FSA. He had a body of work. And so he sat down and showed one of the editors. And so when he went in to see this guy, editor that nobody liked, they're a very gruff guy. I remember other photographers like Horace Bristol telling me how much they disliked this editor there. He goes, "Oh, what do you want?" He goes, and then another editor who brought him in said, "Oh, you really should take a look at his work." He goes, "Oh, okay, fine." And he looked at it. He goes, "Yeah, it's good stuff. What do you want to do for us?" And he said, "Okay, I got to think of something that no white photographer could do." And so he came up with the idea almost instantly of doing the Harlem Street Gang thing. And so that story about Red became his first big story for Life magazine. And then once again, here, okay, you look at the through line or the linear thing. Okay, so I don't know if it was his next story. I think he might have shot some other stuff in the meantime for it. But Ingrid Bergman saw that story. And so she said, when they wanted to do a story, Life wanted to do a story in Stromboli of Ingrid Bergman, with Roberto Rossellini, she says, "Well, let's have Gordon do it." And so that's how we got that. And so that's that one thing leading to another thing. And then, of course, he shot with Life for years. And then a good friend of his, I saw, who I always wanted to interview, and it was really not till many years later that I finally got to meet him, was David Douglas Duncan. Who once again, here's a guy who, parachuted into, Korea, shortly after the outbreak of the war, and the North Korean troops had sort of pushed down to what they call the Busan perimeter. This guy was a gutsy guy for sure, and then he's the one who really brought Nikon to the West, because he was putting Nikon lenses through a guy named June Mickey and Horace Bristol in Japan, saw these lenses, and that's what he brought with him to Korea to shoot. And so you see all these tie-ins that just fascinate me. Just just like you and I, both went into a wet dark room and saw a print come up for the first time, right? And that magic, and for sure, even though I haven't gotten my fingers in developer in years, that magic has never left me.
Yeah, nor I.
Yeah, that's right. It's the same. And look at us. See, we're still out there doing all this stuff, and you're going to be over in Japan soon. I hope you say hello for me.
Oh, we'll do. So,
okay, I appreciate that.
So my last question that I ask each guest is I ask them to recommend another photographer for our listeners to discover and explore, and it could be anyone, someone you've long admired or someone you've recently discovered. So who would that one photographer be, and why?
Well, you've spoken. I think you're almost like 600 people already, so I might be naming a few people you've already spoken with. But have you spoken with Sandro Miller?
Sandro, I Don't think
Sandro
so.
is amazing.
So.
Okay, then you have to, and I can help arrange it. Sandro Miller, I recommend, because he has so many. His work is just so incredible. He's one of the greatest portraitists of our time. But he also, like Irving Penn, will do these incredible still lifes of things. He works a lot with John Malkovich. He did this whole series of 61 portraits of
brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant, yeah.
Yeah. Right, or famous photographs that they work together to put on. So he's on the top of my list, and we teach some workshops together. We first met in India, actually at a workshop, and then we've teamed up in China. We're going to team up again in Chicago. He is on the top of my list for sure, because he doesn't know any barriers at all, and he's not afraid to say what he really thinks with a camera. In terms of, I mean, one of his most recent ones is he addresses all the prejudice that's going on again. Unfortunately, a lot of things are raising their ugly heads that I think a lot of us thought was in the past. And I think that they've been stirred up again for political gain and creating a lot of division. And he takes that straight on with his camera and one of his new series. And what he's had to overcome in his life I mean, I'll let you, because you guys were going to talk for sure about it. But I mean, he had a very severe case of cancer, and so he let that horrible situation eventually inspired his decision to take on this concept of photographing John Malkovich in all these different historic photo scenarios, which, the technical precision has to be, beyond belief, but it's also, having a whole team that can, I mean, how do you reassemble things to look like, Dorothea Lange's, photo of the migrant workers, or, just one image after another. It's like, that's incredible. And so he's on the top of the list for who you have to talk with, and I'll be glad to facilitate that.
Well, I appreciate that, man. And it's so nice to be able to catch up with you.
It's great to catch up to you. And I look forward to coming out to one of your stomping grounds, which is Huntington.
Yeah, you're welcome anytime.
I'm going to take you up on that when I get back from Australia for sure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks to Mark for joining us. Learn more about Mark and his work by visiting markedwardharris.com. And if you're a fan of our work, you can write reviews on whatever service you use to listen to podcasts, and share a favorite episode on social networks, be it Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. Remember to use the hashtag #TheCandidFrame. You can also support us financially by contributing via PayPal or Patreon. I'm leading a half-day photography workshop in Los Angeles in a couple of weeks. If you're interested and in the LA area, please visit the Los Angeles Center of Photography website or click on the link in the show notes. We recently relaunched our newsletter. If you want to receive updates on everything related to the Candid Frame and book recommendations and announcements for special events and workshops, please sign up by visiting our website. And if you can't find every episode of the show on whatever service you use to listen to podcasts, download the Candid Frame app, available for both Apple iOS and Android. And because of your generosity, it's free to download and use. No additional purchases are required. The Candid Frame's audio engineer is Martin Taylor, who you can find at theothermartintaylor.com. And the show's senior producer is Cynthia Parker. And this is Ibarian X, and this is The Candid Frame.